Hi, and welcome back to Lazy Girl Reads. So in today's video, I am going to be talking about the two books that I read for NonFiction November. And I actually read 3 nonfiction books, but I already talked about the other one in the last video, so these are the other 2. So I read The Wager by David Grann, and this book, it was a pretty fun book. The page count is a little deceiving. So if you look at this and you think, wow, that's a really long book about, a shipwreck, it's really not. The first half of the book is about the ship. It's the story of the shipwreck. The second half of the book are notes and footnotes, endnotes, research notes, all about everything that went into David Grann writing this book. So it does appear to be extremely well researched, and there's a lot of primary as well as secondary sources. So all of that is there for anyone who wants to really dig into, where all of this came from. So when you look at the page count, it's really about the first 50%, that's the story of The Wager. And if you haven't heard of this yet, although you probably have because it did win a Goodreads Choice Award this year, it is this true story of a ship that sailed from England with, I think there were 7 ships in total that initially went out with this mission, which was to basically steal the silver that was on a Spanish galleon. So, the original mission was a little shady. But nonetheless, it went out with these other ships. And so a number of these ships ran into problems. But this follows The Wager, and it's the story of the going through all the different things and all the different difficulties that they ran into, weather and not having enough anything really. I mean, during this time, right, this time period, there are a lot of things that are just not ideal about traveling on the ocean, let alone these types of missions going out, which is really, really it's piracy, right? But it's not called piracy because it's being sanctioned by the English government. But either way, it's the whole story about this and how people ended up on the ship going out, the different problems that they had. Like, it took a while for them even to get going onto their mission because they kept running into these problems. Ultimately, the ship is wrecked, and this is the survival story of the people who were on that ship. And the interesting thing is, a group of the shipsmen, I guess, come back to England. They finally make their way back to England, and they tell the story, and they're hailed as heroes, and oh my gosh, this is incredible, the survivor story. And then another group comes back, and they're like, oh no, you are mutineers, and you left us to die, and you're terrible, and you are not heroes, and that's a whole thing. And there's a lot of different versions of what happened depending on who you asked at the time, as I'm sure well as now. And there are people that kept journals, there are people that didn't keep journals. There's some questionable acts all the way around, like a lot of things. So anyway, the author's note, I thought was really interesting because he says in there, we'll never know for sure, I guess, what actually did or didn't go down with this whole shipwreck thing. It all depends on who you believe. And so he basically is just putting it all out there. This is everything I found. This is all the different stories, all the different versions. The reader can determine for themselves who, if anyone, they believe or who they don't. So I thought it was really interesting. I really liked it. There's also some stuff in there that, different sayings and things that I've heard all my life that I didn't realize the origin of them were from sailing, from shipping, or not shipping, like being on ships. I never knew some of this stuff. And so I found that really interesting, that the origin of some of these different things. And they talk about, navigation and how, I mean, I know that they navigated by the stars, like I knew about that. But then also, like, some of the other things that they use, like dead reckoning, and the reason why we measure speed on the water in knots, and just lots of different things in there. So anyway, I thought this was a really well done story. It was able to keep my attention, and I liked it. I thought it was really, really fun. So that was The Wager. The second book that I read for this nonfiction November was Trejo by Danny Trejo. And you all will probably know Danny Trejo is an American actor. He's been in a million things. The minute you Google him, you will see, when his face pops up, you're going to go, oh yeah! Because you've seen him in a lot of things, I'm sure. If you watch any kind of movies or television that's produced in America. I personally found this book to be so much fun, and I loved it so much. I grew up in Southern California, so the place names, a lot of the different things that he talks about were things that I recognized, and so it felt very familiar to me, and it felt like home to me. And just different things that he says and different things that he talks about, it was a lot of fun. So I don't know if you are unfamiliar with kind of the culture of Southern California, or Cholo culture, or just that whole vibe. Like, if you're unfamiliar with that, I don't know if it will hit the same way. So if you live in another country where you don't know about cholos, you don't kind of have that culture, or lowriders, or anything like that, or you live in, I don't know, even some other place in the United States where they don't have that, I don't know if it will hit the same way. But I've got to imagine that every place has, their own kind of things, the way of talking, and different just slang terms and foods, and I don't know, just different things, right? I'm not saying this very well. Every place has their own stuff, right? Their own things that are cultural norms, not necessarily in the wider, bigger term of like the full culture, but just for that area, that wherever it is that you live. And so in Southern California, it's that. And so he talks about like living in the Valley, and he talks about living in Venice Beach, and like just a lot of places that were very familiar to me. So I liked it so much. I had such a good time in this book. I didn't know a lot of the background of Danny Trejo and the history of him and where he came from and all the different things that he went through. And he went through some stuff, man, like for real. He had some very harrowing experiences. He made some, in my opinion, poor choices in, when he was younger and in his youth, and he paid some consequences for those choices as well. And this is the story of him coming through all of that, right? And his relationship with his uncle that was, in some ways, extremely dysfunctional. His uncle did not use good judgment, and yet his uncle gave him the gift of his time and attention, and what that did for him, and the loyalty that engendered in Danny for his uncle, because he paid attention. And that relationship, and his sobriety, and how he eventually achieved his sobriety, and the faith that he has and that he expresses is inspiring, regardless of what your individual faith is, your spirituality, your religious identity, whatever that might be. Even even if you're an atheist or agnostic, whatever your belief system is, to hear about him and his belief system and why it matters to him and how he has lived the second half of his life in a way that I call faith forward, right? He's not knocking anybody else's faith. He's not saying anybody else should believe the way he does or shouldn't believe the way that they do. He's not disrespectful in any way to what anybody thinks. He's just, at least the way I read it, his voice seems to come through to me as saying, this is what worked for me. This is what saved my life. This is how I live my life going forward. And he's just sharing it. He's not trying to convince anybody of anything. He's just saying, this is my story. And then he also talks about, obviously, his path in Hollywood and kind of how he stumbled into that career, and yet how it also makes sense because some of that street hustle that he had as a kid and as a young adult served him well in acting and hustling through Hollywood. And it was just, in turns, heartbreaking, but also inspiring and hurtful, but also hopeful. I just really, really liked it. There were so many things in that book that I was like, wow. Like, it just hit me. Either wow, like, oh my God, I cannot believe you did that. Or, wow, that's amazing that you did that. Whatever that might be. So I liked this book a lot. I definitely would recommend this book. I think it was a fast read. I read this book in a day. It was because I wanted to know, like, what was going to happen next. Where is this going next? Where is this going next? It grabbed me right out of the gate. The very first chapter, it already had my attention right away. And I just, like, I wanted to know what was going on and what's going to happen next. And so I really liked it so much. And like I said, I didn't know a lot about Danny Trejo's backstory. I knew he's an actor. I've seen him in a lot of things. But I had no idea all the things that he had been through to get to where he was when he wrote this book. And it's only been out for a few years, but I liked it a lot. I'm so glad I read it. So glad I read it. So those were the last two books that I read for NonFiction November. And I had fun with it. I think I will do this again next year, and maybe I'll read a few more next year. I've been very busy. Work's been rough. But it was fun, and I liked it. So The Wager and Trejo were the two books that I wrapped up November with, and they were a lot of fun. So anyway, thanks for hanging out with me on Lazy Girl Reads. I'd be interested to know if you did NonFiction November, and if you did, what you read, and whether you would recommend it to me or not, because I'm always looking for that next fun book. So I guess that's it. I'll see you next time. Have a great one. Bye.